Hello everyone and welcome back to another week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard as always. Thank you all for tuning in. Happy Monday here to you all. And on this Monday afternoon, we should have a great show ahead. Starting off with our Monday Night Football preview. We're going to have to do it, even though both of these teams are in bad spots right now. It's the Bengals going up against the Cowboys. Hopefully, this game can be better than I think it is. And then going over my fantasy stars of the NFL weekend. A lot to talk about in that department. Starting my positional rankings for the final week of the fantasy football regular season. Yes, it has come finally with the QB position. Then going over some odds for award season with the Defensive Player of the Year race really heating up. And then concluding with my Don't Be Surprised If segment as always. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you that if you want more content such as this, plus any exclusive shorts that we post, consider liking, following, subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. It is greatly appreciated by all in advance. A lot of great people are doing a lot of great things there. You can check out our website where we have exclusive articles as well. And if you want to interact with us a little bit more directly while we are live streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show as well. You can do it through our website, gsmcpodcast.net. You can leave a question, comment, or concern there, and a tip or a donation as well, or just do it through YouTube. It just makes this show that much better with all your contributions and interactions throughout the show's duration. But without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment of the day. We're going to have to talk about this game, even though it's potentially going to be one of the weirder Monday Night Football games we've had this season. It is the Bengals going up against the Dallas Cowboys, surprisingly, with a better record than them. And the reason being is that the Bengals are simply wasting some of the best moments of Joe Burrow's career as an NFL quarterback. And not for nothing, this team, if it just had at least a pretty competent defense, a middle-of-the-pack defense, could be an AFC playoff contender. But because of the fact, whatever's happening with that defense has really taken its toll on this team. They now sit at 4-8. And it's kind of shocking that right now, the Dallas Cowboys, without Dak Prescott, who had countless injuries this season, especially on their defensive side of the football, come in with a better record at 5-7. But let's talk about both of these teams' strengths, starting off with the Bengals' offense, because Joe Burrow, if this were, say, right now an 8-4 or 8-5 football team rather than a 4-8 football team, chances are Joe Burrow would be firmly in the MVP conversation, if not the front runner. But because of this team's limitations on the defensive side of football, Joe Burrow is getting wasted in this team. And I feel like it's kind of not comeuppance in a sense, but looking at what happened this offseason with the Bengals, with all these weird contract rumors about T. Higgins and then Jamar Chase before the season began, and how that might have impacted this team into where they are now, this offense has truly coalesced together and has really been the more mature unit for the Cincinnati Bengals all year long. Now let's look at the defense, because this defense has star players. It has guys like Trey Hendrickson. Yes, it's lost a little bit of depth, but ultimately has really kind of been underwhelming all year long. This was, in many people's minds before the season, going to be a top 10 unit that complemented what the best of the Bengals offense could be all season long. And that's why a lot of people were very hyped about them in terms of their playoff contender status and potentially their Super Bowl contender status. But now they sit here at 4-8 because of the ineptitudes of that very unit. And it could have been a very different story early in the season had they piled wins in spite of what their defense was putting out on the field. But we're now more than 2.5 quarters of the way through the season, almost 3 quarters of the way through the season, and the Bengals are at 4-8 because of it. Now we look at the Cowboys coming into this one. And this Cowboys team is very weird in many regards, right? Because they lose a lot at home, buy a lot at home, and they don't have their quote-unquote franchise quarterback anymore after that season-ending injury a couple weeks ago. Now they have Cooper Rush that they have to rely upon. He hasn't necessarily played poorly, but he hasn't necessarily played, competently enough to keep this team afloat. Yes, they've won, but I think the major reason as to why they've won is because they got healthier on the better side of the football, and that is the defense. They didn't have Micah Parsons or DeMarcus Lawrence for long stretches of this game. And because of that linebacking core, which was seen as one of the best in the NFL, really was decimated, and a lot of people were able to establish the run game on them. But when you look at the Bengals, that's one of their weaknesses, right? They don't necessarily have the strongest run game. Yes, there's a lot of hope surrounding Chase Brown and what he could potentially be in this roster, but the addition in the offseason of Zach Moss really didn't help them, and they haven't really needed it. But the reason why the Dallas Cowboys have a much better record is because they play complementary football in that they don't necessarily ask Cooper Rush to do that much now that he's starting compared to what they were doing with Dak Prescott. And that's kind of relieved the pressure. Yes, they haven't necessarily played a team the caliber of what the Bengals can bring on the offensive side of the football, and they're going to have to most likely play catch-up in this one. When I look at this defense, and what it's done for this team, the rejuvenation of this unit with the comeback play of Micah Parsons, with the comeback play of DeMarcus Lawrence, and their big guys up front there, I feel like this game could be a lot closer than people think. And I feel like a lot of people actually forgot about these two teams' records, and that everyone is thinking, oh, the Cincinnati Bengals are playing so well offensively. Surely, even though their defense has been bad, they have more than 5 wins. But that's not the case. And if you think about the Cowboys, they've been terrible to start the season, mid-season as well. They have the Dak injury. They can't possibly be sitting at 5 wins, only 2 games below 500, and yet that's where they stand. And so I can't really justify why anyone would place weight on this game in terms of a betting perspective, but it is a fun game to analyze just because both of these teams, their strengths are very strong, but their weaknesses are some of the most flawed in the NFL. And so, looking at this bizarre game, I feel like if you were to bet on it, it would have to come from a place of understanding that these two teams can create chaos in many different ways on a football field when they go up against each other. This can either be a high-scoring game in which the Cowboys are going to have to rely on playing catch-up through the speed of their different players, maybe their special teams scores a couple touchdowns and keeps this game close. Or this is going to be the Cowboys came to lose in that their defense, which has been playing better of late, somehow stymies this Bengals offense. And so that's why I'm not fully confident in terms of who I would necessarily pick to win this game. I will ultimately decide on a winner by the end of this segment, but I don't necessarily feel like I will be convincing you to pick one team or the other. It would just be of a grudging choice because of the weirdness of this game and these two teams specifically. And so I feel like from a betting perspective, Cincinnati being the 5-point favorite, the over-under being 49.5, Cincinnati minus 240, Dallas plus 200, there's definitely space to choose either team in this matchup. It's not like, it's so uneven that you feel you can't justify one team over the other in this matchup. This game certainly could go either way. But then again, I feel like the Bengals offense at home with nothing to play for, going up against a Cowboys team, it certainly feels like their last 2 wins were paper tiger-esque. I certainly feel like there's more of a chance for the Bengals to assert their dominance on offense, score enough points where their defense can kind of try and settle into this game that the Cowboys won't threaten them. I do think the Cowboys eventually will be able to put up points in this one. And I think this game has a nice chance of potentially hitting the over, surprisingly. But it's going to come down to the Bengals' superiority in being able to put up points consistently. That leads me to believe that a Cincinnati Bengals win will be the most likely outcome and what bettors should be advised when betting on. So that's why I'm picking the Bengals. It's a little bit reluctant because this certainly could feel like the bizarre game the Cowboys had against the Commanders where they had timely special teams plays and Cooper Rush did just enough and was efficient enough late in that game for them to win. But I just can't ignore what this Bengals offense is doing. And if they put up enough points, chances are this Cowboys offense simply will not be able to keep up with it. And so that's the reason why I'm taking the Cincinnati Bengals 40-27 in this one. Also look for this game to potentially hit the over because the Cowboys might score some garbage time points for you. But ultimately, that's how I see this game going. There's more of a chance this Bengals offense catches fire than this Cowboys defense has of slowing them down. And that's why I have to choose them. And let me know what you think about this game in the comments because it's truly a bizarre one. I could have gone either way here in just feeling more confident in what the Bengals have to offer for tonight. But coming up next, we transition to looking at some of the fantasy stars of the NFL weekend. A lot in both windows to discuss. We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you wish to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly while we are live streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way as always to contribute and interact. You can do a lot of different things. You can leave a comment or question or concern throughout the show and I'll be able to read it on air. Or you can click the Super Chat button, click the $sign in the comment section, leave a tip or donation. You can do the same at our website as well, gsmcpodcast.net. But overall, this makes the show that much better when you, my faithful audience, are contributing to it. So without further ado, let us jump right into today's second segment, going over some NFL fantasy stars of the weekend, second to last week of the fantasy football regular season before we get into some playoff talk. And this week truly established who you can rely on in certain regards, whether they be high-end talent, who you will always want to start, or guys who came on late in the season and could continue to perform for you come playoff time. So without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with perhaps the best quarterback performance of the entire week with Sam Darnold. This guy has been incredible. He's not going to receive many plaudits in terms of end-of-season awards. He certainly is potentially not going to go to the NFL honors, even if he were nominated for MVP, but he is playing like a top 10 quarterback in the NFL. He's top 10 in passing yards, completion percentage, yards per attempt, what have you, and this game proved it all. Yes, it was against a very weak Falcons defense, but it was generating a lot more pressure than in recent weeks. But Sam Darnold still, despite all that pressure, was able to extend plays, get the ball downfield, and most importantly, put points on the board to the tune of 34.58 fantasy points off of 22 of 28 passing, 347 yards, and a grand total of 5 touchdowns, one of his best performances ever. Not since he was potentially a Jet early on in his Jet career did he have as solid a performance as he had Sunday against Atlanta. And I feel like, a lot of people might not want to go into the postseason with Sam Darnold in any capacity, whether it be a QB1 or QB2 even, but he certainly is someone who has shocked us all in a delightful manner, and might be someone you might want to monitor should he land somewhere else and get another chance there. Because this season has proved that Sam Darnold is still a talented quarterback who went number 3 overall 6 years ago. And that's why I feel like this fantasy performance from him may not overwhelm me one way or the other in terms of deciding if you want to stick with him, should you have started him this season or not. But this is also in terms of the long term. I'm just not looking at this from a right here, right now perspective. Sam Darnold has proven that he can do this countless times. Maybe he might go back to struggling with a different team because Minnesota certainly feels like a perfect fit for him. But he's certainly proven everyone wrong in terms of how the season could pan out for him in Minnesota. And kudos to Kevin O'Connell as well for truly developing him into the scheme, allowing him to do a lot of things that make him comfortable, and ultimately really contending for the Coach of the Year award as well, which we might talk about in latter weeks. But in terms of Sam Darnold, in terms of fantasy perspectives, I really think this guy could be special for you in the postseason, but also in the long term, down the road in the next 3 to 5 years, should he find a new home and thrive there as well. But in terms of the running back position, this is a very unique opportunity for me to kind of apologize to Zach Charbonnet, someone who I said will never really be kind of an explosive back for my Seattle Seahawks. And he truly did have a great performance, and I promise I will never slander him again as a Seattle fan. But I gotta credit another guy who's really come on late in this season, but with all the question marks surrounding his position group on this specific team, and what he's been able to do to help rejuvenate the career of his young quarterback. Let's talk about Chuba Hubbard here. Yes, Zach Charbonnet, I could have put him in here, but in the early window, no one impressed me more than Chuba Hubbard and what he means to this Carolina offense as it continues to find out more and more about Bryce Young. 26 carries, 92 yards, 1 touchdown in their near upset attempt of the Philadelphia Eagles on the road. And I think a large part of why Bryce Young is starting to feel so rejuvenated is because of the help he's receiving from his backfield. This isn't just down to Bryce Young immediately becoming better. It's coming down to the overall play of every single member of that offense as a collective unit. Yes, we can see major improvements in the mechanics and footwork perhaps, and the arm strength and accuracy of Bryce Young in the pocket, but if it weren't for guys like Chuba Hubbard, Bryce Young may still be the tentative, impatient quarterback who we saw early in his career. That's why I have to applaud Chuba Hubbard, despite the fact that, as a Seattle Seahawks fan, I always love singing the praises of unsung heroes in every win we have. But Chuba Hubbard, I simply cannot ignore for gutsy performances week in, week out over these last 3 weeks, and potentially, from a fantasy perspective, a potential flex option for you if you wish to make a deep playoff run, potentially a starter as well, because the Panthers are playing passionately these past couple of weeks, win or lose. They're going to be a tough out on the stretch for people, so look for Chuba Hubbard to continue to get meaningful touches in that offense as well. And then, so goes Sam Darnold, so goes Justin Jefferson. No surprise there. Technically not the leading receiver even in this offense, as Jordan Addison also had a fantastic day as well. But Justin Jefferson, he was someone who I pinpointed in my shadow report last week in terms of his match against AJ Terrell, whether or not it would be more about him putting up nice numbers or opening up space. And the answer was both, because both him and Addison had career days. He had 7 receptions, 132 yards, 2 touchdowns, and I believe Jordan Addison had 1 more yard and 1 more catch than him in the same stat line. So ultimately, that game proved that both of them could work together. Now, they're going to have tougher games in the stretch, right? But this proves that Justin Jefferson is so multifaceted that even if Addison's going off, you can't slip up against him, because he has the ability to put up numbers as well. This is the first true time this season where Minnesota had both of their receivers be so impactful in a game. And yes, people are definitely going to hammer home the fact that Atlanta is not a defense who you're going to be facing come playoff time if you're the Vikings. But I was really pleasantly surprised to see Jefferson also stand out in this one as well, because these past couple of weeks were all about developing the other weapons in this offense and Justin Jefferson simply making space for them. But now we know that he, as well as Addison, can coalesce. And that's how this potent Minnesota offense can continue to get better and more dangerous. So kudos to both Sam Darnold and Justin Jefferson being dynamic in this one, and kind of a revenge game against the Atlanta Falcons. I mean, not necessarily a revenge game, but certainly wanting to compound Kirk Cousins' misery. So that's why it's kind of a revenge game. But I digress. Last but not least, in terms of tight ends for this week, not a lot of solid overall tight end performances, but Pat Freiermuth seemingly was the most timely in their win over Cleveland and getting their own revenge for that weird snow game 2 weeks ago. Leading receiver, surprisingly, without George Pickens for the Pittsburgh Steelers, 2 receptions, 48 yards, and 1 touchdown. And that's the beauty of Pat Freiermuth, right? This is just a very bizarre guy. This is just someone who either makes his impact known in small spurts or truly steps into a role as a go-to target for this Pittsburgh Steelers offense, no matter who the quarterback is. He's had a lot of quarterbacks in his career, and so with Russell Wilson, who knows what can happen with him? Who knows what can happen with him come playoff time if the Steelers should get there. But overall, Pat Freiermuth is someone who I have to acknowledge in terms of him being one of those tight ends who you're not necessarily saying is in that first tier, right? You're not necessarily considering him anything special, but he's certainly kind of 1A, 1B range, maybe 2A, 2B range for the tight end position. But overall, all of these 4 guys, really, really dynamic players. There were definitely a lot of other players that I talked about. For example, Zach Charbonnet. He really, really could be a treat. If Kenneth Walker continues to be out with that calf injury, we really don't know many details about that calf injury, but if he continues to be out and they continue to entrust Zach Charbonnet and entrust this offensive line, most importantly, which had its best game this year because of the continuity they were able to gain these past couple of weeks with that starting 5 up front, then Zach Charbonnet could be more than what I said before about him, a home run hitter. And what about the front runner for the MVP award? Let's talk about Josh Allen. Even in a loss, this guy continues to prove he's the MVP of the National Football League this season. 3 rushing touchdowns, 3 passing touchdowns. Not since the great Otto Graham in the 1954 NFL Championship did a quarterback put up that stat line. Think about that. Josh Allen is a truly special player, a truly special athlete. He hasn't necessarily had the opportunity to prove he can be the face of this league, and maybe if he just wins this one MVP award, people will still doubt that he is. But he's quickly becoming it, and even though the Bills took a really tough loss in a really bizarre game where they put up that many points without turning the ball over, truly unheard of in the NFL, Josh Allen proved his might. And you had guys underperforming a little bit, quote-unquote, Saquon Barkley, Jalen Hurts for the Eagles, and others as well. Potentially, some Cardinals players in that loss. I don't want to harp on that and harp on, the Seahawks being unbeaten in that rivalry, but the Cardinals definitely disappoint me in this game. I did say there was a chance that they would be able to match whatever the Seahawks offensive output would be in this game, but I was mistaken. Kyler still looks a little bit erratic in the pocket in that one. Marvin Harrison can't get going, and surprisingly, Trey McBride, who's had a solid past couple of weeks, simply could not get going until late in the game in that one as well. So ultimately, whether disappointment or overperformance, overachievement, fantasy stars this weekend were not necessarily few and far between for you. And it's going to be really important come playoff time to continue to pinpoint the unsung heroes and the high-end talent to truly create that balance in your team, because it's all about balance, like I love to say, when you're playing fantasy football this late in the year. But to conclude this segment, coming up next, we're going to be talking about the first of our positional rankings for the final week of the fantasy football regular season, starting with our QBs here and who could potentially get you into the playoffs if you're potentially still looking to get in there or to help you bolster your case as the top team in your league. So we'll be right back after this short break to talk about that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of today's show, we're starting our positional rankings, our final positional rankings for the regular season, at least, of the fantasy football season. I can't believe I am saying those words. What a ride here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, talking about the players who define the fantasy football season for you all, potentially coming to a close here. I may decide to continue into the playoffs. We'll see. But for now, just know that it's truly been a pleasure trying to come up with all these different players at each position and trying to create a list that potentially be applicable each and every single week. And for the final week, I just tried to get a little bit weird as well, because this might be the time where if you're firmly cemented yourself in the playoff picture, you might be sitting some guys, or if you want to make that last minute playoff push, you might try and bolster your squad and making some additions. But ultimately, I try to keep this list as open as possible, because no matter where you are in the fantasy football season, it's always going to be a question about analyzing different guys, potentially preparing for next year as well, to see who could potentially step up for you there. So without further ado, our final positional rankings of the regular season of the fantasy football season. Starting off with a guy who last night did kind of get banged up a little bit with a bruised leg, expected to play in this matchup against Tampa Bay, but really is going to have to prove his mettle down the stretch here, because he really now is this entire offense, and what he can do from here on out as his LA Chargers try and make that last-minute playoff push, maintain their wildcard status in the AFC. He's going to have to become the guy he was kind of under the Brandon Staley regime, right? And that is Justin Herbert. And throughout the season, Justin Herbert's been through a lot of trials and tribulations, even before the season, right? When Jim Harbaugh came in, having to learn this new philosophy of kind of stepping away from trying to be that gunslinging quarterback that he was in the Brandon Staley era to now. And so, with all this hubbub going on around him, the fact that he had so many injuries to start the season, the fact that, the running back situation wasn't even settled fully deep into the season, and now that J.K. Dobbins potentially out for the season, Justin Herbert, the burden placed on his shoulders is now going to become a lot more heavy, because right now the Chargers are in a fantastic spot. Yes, they lost to the Chiefs, but I was kind of right in that they would have a chance, and it's just the Chiefs' magic and luck that got them the win. But ultimately, I want to see how he does in this matchup, especially because this Bucks team, they're also fighting for their playoff lives here, and their defense really isn't necessarily too bad or too good. They're very middling in almost every single metric. And so if Justin Herbert is 75 to 100% for this one, look for him to have a big say in the outcome of this game. This is going to be a lot closer than people think. I believe that, this Chargers team, a lot of people are starting to place a lot more stock in. But let's be real here. Both of these teams, the Chargers and the Bucks, are in very advantageous positions that potentially they might not expect themselves to be in based off different situations. But here they are. They both have an opportunity to cement themselves as true wildcard contenders in their respective conferences. But the reason why I'm so high on Justin Herbert this week is because of the fact that he just feels like whenever situations are going awry around him, that he can step up and rise above them. And that's all you want in an NFL quarterback, even in this very odd situation that the Chargers find themselves in. And not for nothing, for what it's worth, I don't necessarily think that the Chargers get into the playoffs. They will be a threat. I wish they could be, because they really are an entertaining team to watch in many different rights. Maybe not most entertaining offense to watch at times, but still, I feel like it's going to come down to Justin Herbert's development and maturity. He's now been with two head coaches with two differing philosophies, drastically differing philosophies. But now he's in a situation where potentially he has to revert to the hero ball early in his career. And if he does that, then I slowly become a little bit more hopeful and optimistic about what the Chargers can do with him this season. But if he doesn't, then I really don't know which direction this Chargers team is going to head in. Because I still think this defense is excellent, but it's going to come down to the play of this offense that's really going to matter if the Chargers want to have a say in the AFC playoffs. But in this matchup, look for him to try and remain as efficient as possible, also proving he can still be the heroic kind of quarterback he was in that bygone Brandon Staley era. And the next guy I want to talk about, we talked about him a little bit before. How about Bryce Young against the Cowboys? This is another matchup where I think the Panthers are going to be right in the thick of it, because even though this Cowboys defense should feel they have the advantage in this one, and they most certainly could, I feel like what I said applies to every single player in this Carolina Panthers offense. They've been rejuvenated under Bryce Young, whether it be the running game with Chuba Hubbard. And yes, it's unfortunate, we'll talk about later, the Jonathan Brooks injury, but Chuba Hubbard has been admirable stepping in as the replacement for him. And you add in the play of this offensive line that's playing like it's never played before. And this is going to be a tough out for this Cowboys defense. I feel like, 12.54 fantasy points against Philly does not tell the whole story of what Bryce Young was able to do in that one. He was a Xavier Legette drop away from beating the Philadelphia Eagles in a game where a lot of people thought the Philadelphia Eagles would quiet the Panthers once and for all. They're a little bit of a push here in these last couple of weeks, but no. They stuck around, and they're going to continue to do it until the season's end. And Bryce Young's going to prove that he can still be a competent quarterback in the NFL week in, week out here. So that's why I'm picking him. A lot of you might not pick him unless, of course, you're number one in your fantasy football playoff race right now, and you're just trying to look through different options you might want to look into for the future. But right now, Bryce Young is a fun guy to look at and say, from where he was when he was benched to now, he could potentially be a player in many years to come in fantasy football circles everywhere. So that's why I'm really looking at him now compared to, say, at the start of this little run for him when nobody knew what he could be. So that's why I want to highlight him a little bit more now. And the third guy I want to talk about, also kind of in a slump right now, but ultimately, this game could be his get-right game, and he has the easiest schedule in the entire NFC West, in my opinion, to get right as well. That is Kyler Murray going up to the Patriots. I wish the Seahawks had as easy a schedule as the Cardinals do in their last couple of games. He still had 17.96 fantasy points against Seattle. He had 2 touchdowns as well in that matchup, but he's still apt to make mistakes. He's still someone who looks a little bit erratic, and he hasn't really looked the same after the bye from where he was earlier on in the season when he was making almost every right play, using his legs to the best of his ability, and truly proving what he could be at his best for this Arizona offense. But ultimately, the reason why this game against the Patriots is going to be so telling about these past couple of weeks is there still could be a chance where Kyler Murray looks more like he's been these past 3 weeks or so. There still could be a chance that this Patriots defense stymies him, much like the Seahawks defense has done these past couple of weeks, and what several other defenses have been able to do in certain moments against Kyler Murray, like the Vikings, for example. Ultimately, why I put Kyler Murray on this list is because I know he has the ability, and I know a lot of people are still on the fence about him and still might be making last-minute decisions about him. They might be going into the fantasy football playoffs with him on their roster thinking, well, how's he going to look down the stretch? And the answer is, this week's schedule certainly gives him the opportunity to right everything that went wrong these past couple of weeks for him. And so that's why you can't necessarily give up hope if you have him in your roster that he's not going to get back to the elite level he was at before the bye. And so that's why I feel like this time around, Kyler Murray is going to continue to prove that he is going to be a viable asset in the fantasy football players, and no matter what capacity you need him in. And that's why I have to pick him. And again, it's not like he was performing too badly these past couple of weeks. And I feel like, but with everything going on in the NFC West, he still has a chance to make amends. And so that's why Kyler Murray is someone who I'm actually very high on going into the fantasy football playoffs because of that schedule and because they know they're still in the NFC West race, which is most important as well, because that will really bring out the passion in their play again against these weaker opponents. So that's why I have to slot in Kyler Murray here on this list. And last but not least, this one's a little bit ambitious. This one truly is if you feel confident that you should bench everyone on your roster and you just want to have fun in your final regular season week of fantasy football. Let's talk about Mac Jones against the Jets. This one definitely could be an interestingly weird hit, but I also feel like after yesterday, even though the Jags won and they showed that potentially Doug Peterson still might have the locker room, I don't know what Mac Jones had to do with it, because it was more so with the defense than anything Mac Jones did. But he was at least reliable in the fourth quarter. I was kind of looking at this as, an interesting one where the Jets might pack it in, and they still might pack it in following that heartbreaking overtime loss to the Dolphins. But yeah, this one I can't really justify. This is more so if, like I said, you're sitting everyone out and you potentially picked up Mac Jones off the waiver wire just to have. And you want to see, if Mac Jones can prove that should, he catch the eye of another team, he can be the bridge guy and potentially might want to get fantasy production out of him next year. But ultimately, that scheme is a little bit far-fetched. So that's why, I'm kind of reeling it back here, but we'll see, because the Jets' defense isn't really anything special right now, nothing to phone home about. And I feel like, that win said something about that little iota of optimism this Jacksonville Jaguars season has to close out the year. And so, if they rely on Mac Jones and this defense, then anything can happen. And so, that's why I kind of wanted to include him in this list, even though he might not deserve it. But let me know what you think about it in the comments below, because coming up next, we look at another NFL awards race, Defensive Player of the Year, perhaps the most heated race out of all of them this NFL awards season. You definitely don't want to miss it right after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of the day here on today's show, we're continuing with our updated NFL awards season projections based off of Vegas's odds with the Defensive Player of the Year race. Very heated race. Finally a race where it's not all about the front seven. We're starting to see a couple corners, a couple safeties, some secondary guys get some love, and for what it's worth, deservedly so. I really think that this race isn't as done and dusted as people might think, and I feel like we could see a new winner and a reemergence of young secondary talent being able to break this monotony of either ends or D linemen or even linebackers winning this award. But without further ado, let us jump right into the excitement of this DPOY race right now. Starting off with the guy coming in with the fifth longest odds or fifth best odds, was whatever you choose. A guy at the safety position you can't deny has really been a tremendous player for this Packers defense. Even though, I've said countless times that he was just waiting to get exposed and the secondary was waiting to get exposed, they still haven't to this day. And I'm really scared to face them this week as a Seattle Seahawks fan. Let's talk about Xavier McKinney, though. Guy comes in from the New York Giants to really bolster this Packers secondary next to Jair Alexander. What does he do? Leads the league in interceptions. And at plus 2,000, he's probably the best value for a secondary player right now. But his main issue is that as a safety, I don't really know how much respect he's going to get. It's all going to depend on how the Packers really look and close out the season, because they're really the mystery here in the NFC, right? Because you have the top dogs in the Lions and the Eagles, right? Potentially the two best teams. But after that, you're really split between the Vikings, the Packers, potentially the Seahawks if they win this weekend. But the Packers haven't really differentiated themselves just yet. I really don't know what identity they're going to assume over these next couple of weeks. And it may stem down to how this defense plays, because that's the true core of what I see when I see the best of the Packers, this defense playing well. And so if Xavier McKinney can get more takeaways and this Packers secondary continues to do well against top-level competition, then chances are he can move up this board. And chances are we could see him take home the DPOY award. But for now, sitting at number 5 in the odds, I would not be surprised if he potentially dropped a little bit or other players just made more compelling cases. And he's also a cornerback or safety or secondary player, what have you. He falls under that umbrella, and thus points are taken away from him for that as well, because they really are going to focus a lot more on linebackers and edge rushers, what have you. So that's why I feel like Xavier McKinney, while he certainly could make the case, just doesn't have the most compelling one in this race. The number 4 guy who's already won this award before, potentially could just do it again, Myles Garrett, and plus 2,000 as well. And Myles Garrett, yes, potentially seen as a quote-unquote down year just because his Browns do not have a winning record like they did last year. But I do think, not for nothing, that Myles Garrett, by name and brand alone, is in this race. Because you look at this Browns defense and how much it's regressed. I feel like the main reason why a lot of people still love it is because of Myles Garrett. And the reason why a lot of people still respect this unit is because of the pull and respect that Myles Garrett receives in return from the NFL because of his play. And it's not often that someone who has played for a very moribund franchise for most of his career has this much gravitas in the NFL, no matter how he's playing, how his team is playing. And that's why he's in the discussion. But that being said, his 3-9 Browns team is not going to do enough to bolster his case. There are a lot of players on a lot of better teams on this list ahead. So, while I feel like it can be justifiable based off stats alone, if Myles Garrett wins this award, I can't see it because of the Browns' record and where they are at this current moment in time. And so, as much as I would love to see him take home the award another time, it just feels like this team has failed him time in and time out in terms of its ability to really play consistently to complement what he brings to them. And so that's why he sits at number 4 rather than a little bit higher on this list ahead of some other contenders. But at number 3, our secondary player on this list. I'm telling you, this rejuvenation, this revolution rather, is coming. Pat Surtain II. And what he doesn't have in terms of takeaways compared to McKinney, he has just being a lockdown corner. And sometimes that's all you have to do to gain respect in the NFL. Plus 1,500. He was named the number 1 cornerback in the league by ESPN in the offseason, and he's proved it. And like I said, not many stats. I believe he only has 2 interceptions this year. He has a lot of passes defended, but ultimately, stats-wise, the committee might not go for him just because of the fact that he doesn't have takeaways to his name. But I do feel like another reason why he's at only number 3 is because of the fact this quote-unquote no-name, even to the Broncos, has actually played well around him. Because if it were more anomalous, I think it would have worked more for him, much unlike what Myles Garrett is going through, because of the fact he's an anomalous player on what could have been a much worse defense. Because his defense is playing so well with him, his talents are kind of going a little bit more understated as well, because we're now growing to respect the entire Broncos defense and not just Pat Surtain. We're respecting guys like Riley Moss, Jaquan McMillan, Zach Allen, what have you. And so that's why Pat Surtain sits a little bit low on this list, because for all intents and purposes, he could have been number 1 on this list for just the ability to be the most exceptional cover corner in the NFL today. But because of the play of his defense collectively, I feel like his talents are kind of a little bit more under the radar this year compared to other years when he was simply playing on a much worse defense and his talents were thus brought more into the spotlight. And that's why he sits at number 3 rather than potentially number 1, because he very well could be. But I think he could be hard done by with a number 2 guy, because I really don't see any justification as to this guy being this high based off his own play and his team play as well. But, based off where he was last year in his rookie season compared to now, I feel like he still is one of the most valuable players for his squad, I must say, this season. And not for nothing, for what it's worth, could be the reason that they get into the postseason, the reason they might make some noise there as well. He is Will Anderson. And when I look at this Texans team and the reason why I feel like Will Anderson should not be this high in terms of odds is because of the fact that this defense, while the best part of this team, still does not look like the unit it looked like last year. And this team as a whole does not look like the team it was last year. And that's the issue I have. Because let's say this Texans team really regressed, and they were more like a 9-8 team rather than a 11-6, 10-7 team. Then, if Will Anderson played a big role in that campaign and they stuck into the playoffs and they upset somebody, then potentially I could have said, well, that alone could propel Will Anderson into the conversation alone. But this season, I really can't see, because now we know that the Houston Texans are kind of paper tigers right now. Now we see the cracks of the foundation there. And so that's why I feel like it's not justified. He is still 7th in sacks in the league, but it's only at 9.5. And right now, I feel like the number one guy just has a more compelling case on a more compelling defense than Will Anderson right now. But potentially, I could be proven wrong. And on the stretch, the Houston Texans get better. They fix and adjust, and ultimately they could make a deep playoff from it. Until I see that, I can't really justify the reason to Will Anderson being this high in terms of betting odds. But the number one guy should not surprise many of you. It's TJ Watt. I really do not have to explain too much in depth about TJ Watt here. Plus 190, the best value by far on potentially the best defense in the NFL right now. And a lot of people were going to wonder probably before the season how it would fit with Patrick Queen, how those two explosive guys would coalesce, and the answer is they've done it swimmingly. I feel like TJ Watt really has become more of the edge rusher hybrid that a lot of people love him for, and Patrick Queen has been more of the communicator, and it's really worked to a T for this team. And that's the reason why TJ Watt is the number one prospect for DPOY this year. So I feel like overall this race is very heated, but if TJ Watt remains number one, I can't see anyone really knocking him off that perch, even though a lot of players could say they have a better season at their respective positions, like David McKinney and Pat Surtain. It's going to be hard if TJ Watt is right now the betting favorite to knock him off that perch, like I say. But let me know what you think in the comments about this race. I think it's a lot tighter than people give it credit for, and I don't want to call it right now, but I'm placing good money on TJ Watt controlling the top of the betting odds for the time being. But to conclude today's show, we're going to be doing my don't be surprised if someone makes some bold statements for the final week of fantasy football regular season. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our final segment, it's as always my favorite segment of the Monday show, my Don't Be Surprised If segment. And this weekend, why not go crazy for the final weekend of the fantasy football regular season? So these takes might be a lot bolder in nature just because I wanted to get fun with it, just because as we prepare for the playoffs, it's nice to alleviate the pressure that's going to be placed on you as you make your last-minute decisions for the playoff push ahead. But as always, it's a great way to conclude today's show, to get you thinking even as we wind down this fantasy football season together. So without further ado, let's jump right into the final Don't Be Surprised If segment before the regular season comes to a close. And to start off, we kind of suggested this a little bit in our QB rankings, and this is perhaps the boldest take I've ever had on this segment, and I'm glad it's one of the final ones as well. The Jaguars compounding the Jets' misery with Mac Jones surprising. Why not have this be one of my hits that really does hit? And so I feel like the reason why I'm so high on the Jaguars is because right now, the Jaguars are in a unique place where they know that they're a terrible team, but that win over the Titans kind of felt like one of those moments where they feel like they can play themselves out of a top draft pick. And looking at this Jags team, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case because it's a lot more talented than people give it credit for. And in the offseason, if they do let go of Peterson, which I do think they will, this team is going to be one of the more appealing ones just because I don't necessarily think it's as damaged as it looks. But in terms of Mac Jones' side of things, and in terms of how he can play against the Jets, it's going to really stem down to how this Jags team kind of feels about his situation, right? Because Mac Jones is in a very weird situation where he knows he's going to conclude the season. He knows that more often than not, he's going to be the underdog. More often than not, he's going to potentially lose these last couple of games. But if he plays for pride, chances are he could end up on an NFL roster next year, potentially as a bridge quarterback or as a competent backup. And so this is the game where we potentially see Mac Jones playing for his NFL life here. And so that's why I feel like Mac Jones potentially surprised. And not for nothing, this is still a very talented receiving corps, even without its top two guys. I feel like, even though they abandoned Parker Washington, much to my chagrin, after I named him to my waiver wire list, he's still very talented. There could still be something there, and Brian Thomas Jr. is still an electrifying receiver when he has the ball in his hands. So if they trust that against the Jets defense that is entirely underwhelmed this season, I think the Jags potentially could come true on this claim here and really make me look like a genius in the last week of the fantasy football regular season here. But it's all going to depend on if the Jaguars play for both Doug Peterson and Mac Jones. It can't just be for Doug Peterson at this point because Mac Jones wants to play for something too. And so even if it's just for the Jaguars' backup role next season, he's going to want to play with pride, and it's just about the team really working with him here and not against him. So that's what made me really want to make this claim this week. But then the second one I want to talk about is this Bengals offense. We kind of talked about it against this Cowboys defense tonight, but going up against the Titans defense, who still played very well against the Jags this week, but kind of fell apart in the fourth quarter, and how they can play against this Bengals offense. I think that this Bengals offense could potentially be stymied by the Tennessee Titans. Let's talk about teams who have underwhelmed but have had units really step up in unexpected ways. And the Titans defense really has. Yes, they have a lot of injuries that really kind of stopped their development. For example, the L'Jarius Sneed injury, their secondary really has been disappointing over the past couple of weeks, but they're still one of the top pass defenses in the league. This run unit is really, really impressive. I like a lot of pieces there. Harold Landry, Jeffrey Simmons is there. I really think that this Titans defense is underrated, but it's going to all have to come together in a very tough matchup against the Bengals this week. And I don't really think their offense is really capable of keeping up with this Bengals offense. Is going to come down to what this Titans defense does, and I do think there can be moments where this Titans defense really slows down this Bengals offense at certain moments. It's going to take a village, but I think that the Titans defense is a unit that I've grown to respect this season, despite the fact that from a fantasy perspective, it may not have been an appealing choice to take them. So that's why I feel like this Titans team can spring one final surprise for you this fantasy season. And then, the third one I want to talk about, how about in this weird matchup? I believe this is the Sunday night football game this week. Steelers against the Eagles in a battle of attrition, really. Two very solid defenses, two very potent offenses in different ways. How about Saquon, as always, being the X factor in this battle of the trenches? I do think this is going to be a low-scoring affair here. I don't necessarily think one team is going to assert its dominance over the other, and I do feel like there are going to be moments where it's going to be really rough for this Eagles offense. I think that the fact that Jalen Hurts really has been poor in terms of passing output, not to say that he's been poor in a sense that he's turning the ball over, because he's been very efficient these past couple of games, but only 226 passing yards in these past 2 games as well, leads me to believe that this game is going to come down to Saquon's play. And so, in the trenches, going up against this elite linebacking core, Saquon's going to have to find ways, whether it be rushing or receiving, to really get this Eagles ground game and offense really going, because I think the Steelers have the better opportunity in this matchup to take advantage of the fact that this passing attack isn't as potent as people think. And that's why Saquon's really going to have to step up. And that's past game against the Panthers. He really, even though he had his 9th 100-yard game of the season, an Eagles franchise record, did it in an underwhelming fashion where he didn't really separate himself from the Panthers. And so that's why in this one, he's really going to have to step into this role of being a guy who can really take a game over. And so that's what's really going to stand out in this one, is can Saquon really be the X factor that really makes the Eagles a serious contender, not just in the NFC, but to reach the Super Bowl and usurp the Detroit Lions while doing it. And that's the key here. Speaking of the Detroit Lions, my final claim here, my don't be surprised if segment for the fantasy football regular season, is Jared Goff underwhelming against the Bills. Now, this kind of looks a little bit silly considering what the Bills defense did, but granted, a couple of those points were on special teams, and I don't necessarily think this Bills defense is as bad as what happened yesterday against the Los Angeles Rams. The Los Angeles Rams, not for nothing, got hot, man. Like, this offense it's not like this offense wasn't going to be potent with Kupp and Nakua back. We know what this Rams offense can be when Kupp and Nakua are playing at that level. And so I can't really blame the Bills defense. But it certainly made this take a little bit more silly in nature. But I do think that Jared Goff is going to err on the side of efficiency a lot more in games such as these, because of the fact that he still is the guy who doesn't want to make mistakes. He still is the guy who wants to be more competent than superstar. And so that's what separates him in my mind from the guys we think of as elite, right? Because Josh Allen, for example, the guy he's going to face off against in this matchup, he's a guy who's unafraid to mess up because he just really wants to help his team win. Same for Patrick Mahomes, same for Lamar Jackson in some regards, in similar regard, potentially Jalen Hurts. But Jared Goff is still more the safe pair of hands rather than the ultimate game wrecker. And this is not an indictment of him. He's still a very stellar quarterback in his own right, and I really respect what he's done with this Detroit Lions roster. But in terms of output here, from a fantasy perspective, I still think a lot of people are disregarding him just because of the fact that he's not necessarily a guy who's going to put up the gaudy numbers. He's the guy who's going to be efficient. He's the guy who's going to win football games by not turning the football over, and that's going to have to be enough for a lot of people who choose to take the risk on him. And in this potential Super Bowl preview, what's going to come down to is who blinks first. And yes, we all know that Josh Allen is someone who's prone to turn the football over himself. And that very well could be the difference in this game in terms of generating positive field position for your team and creating short fields. But I do think that what I mean by underwhelmed isn't entirely based off of stats. I mean, it's not necessarily going to be a game to remember fantasy-wise for Jared Goff. I don't necessarily think that he's not going to produce enough for the Detroit Lions to win, but it's going to be a game where it's going to be very understated. He's going to put up, say, 200, 220 yards of offense, maybe only have 1 to 2 touchdowns, and do it on, say, 22 completions. That's the kind of underwhelming nature I'm getting here. He's not going to light up the scoreboard, throw the football 40 times like a Josh Allen would. He's going to stay conservative, potentially to the detriment of fantasy football managers everywhere, in order to better protect his team. Because let's be real here, the Lions defense is also banged up. 13 players in the Lions defense are under reserve right now. That's almost 2 times more than the next team. And so that's why I feel like this game is going to come down to control for Jared Goff in this offense. And that's why I feel like for this last take ever of the Don't Be Surprised If segment, Jared Goff might be underwhelming in the last week of the regular season, the fantasy football season. That will just about do it for today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you for tuning in. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network. Make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube as well to continue to contribute and interact with the show more directly. But other than that, see you tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. I am out until then.